Berlin was a graveyard in the spring of 1945. Smoke rose like ghosts from the ruins, and the air smelled of dust, gunpowder, and death. The thunder of Soviet artillery echoed through what was left of the city as tanks rolled over streets that once carried parades. Deep beneath those shattered stones, in a maze of concrete corridors, the man responsible for Europe's destruction spent his final days. Hitler's bunker was no grand fortress. It was a tomb built of fear. The walls were cracked, the air stale, and the lights flickered weakly as if struggling to survive like the man himself. Secretaries whispered in corners, soldiers moved in silence, and the tension in those final hours was so thick that even the sound of footsteps felt like betrayal. Everyone inside knew the end had come. Hitler refused to leave, trapped not just by the Soviets outside, but by his own madness. On April 30th, the silence of the bunker was broken by a single gunshot. The man who once terrorized the world had chosen to die underground, leaving behind chaos and questions that would echo through history. When Soviet troops reached the Reich chancellery above, they had no idea what waited below their boots. The soldiers who stormed through Berlin's final defenses had seen horrors on every street: bodies of civilians, SS officers who had turned their guns on themselves, children wearing Hitler Youth armbands clutching empty rifles. Yet the bunker beneath was different. It was quiet, unnervingly so. As they moved down the narrow stairways, the smell of smoke and decay grew stronger. When they reached the final corridor, they found the remains of a scene both pathetic and surreal. A small room with overturned chairs, half-burned documents, and the faint remains of two bodies near a sofa. The corpses were partly burned, faces unrecognizable, the air still heavy with the stench of gunpowder and gasoline. Soviet officers quickly realized they were standing in the place where Adolf Hitler had taken his last breath. But the world's most wanted man was now a pile of ash and bone, and verifying that truth would become one of history's most secretive investigations. The Soviet command immediately sealed off the area. No one was allowed to enter without direct orders. Stalin wanted proof, irrefutable proof, that Hitler was truly dead. The NKVD, the Soviet secret police, were sent in to collect every trace of evidence. They dug through the rubble, scraped burned remains from the ground, and packed fragments of bone and teeth into small boxes. Witnesses were interrogated for hours: Hitler's guards, his aides, even the secretaries who had watched him disappear into his room moments before the gunshot. Every story was slightly different, and Stalin grew suspicious. He could not believe that his greatest enemy had ended his life so easily. He suspected escape, perhaps through Argentina, perhaps through the Americans. So he demanded that no word of Hitler's death be released to the public until Moscow confirmed every detail. This decision began a web of secrecy that would confuse the world for decades. Even within his own ranks, Stalin let the rumor spread that Hitler had survived. It was a strategic lie that gave him reason to keep Soviet troops deep inside Europe long after the fighting had ended. Meanwhile, deep inside the bunker, Soviet investigators catalogued everything that remained. The rooms were small and suffocating, lined with concrete that seemed to sweat from the heat of the fires above. They found maps scattered across tables, pins marking cities that no longer existed as battlefronts. Half-finished meals sat beside bottles of wine. On a nearby desk lay Hitler's personal revolver, his military cap, and the burned remnants of photographs. In one corner, a small bed where Eva Braun had slept, still covered in ash and dust. The Soviets photographed every item carefully, each picture a piece of evidence in what would become one of history's most important mysteries. Yet even as they worked, a strange feeling hung in the air. They were not standing in the quarters of a mighty leader, but in the final refuge of a man consumed by his own delusion. The bunker told a story that no victory speech could capture. It was the physical embodiment of a collapsing empire, the last breath of a regime built on terror and lies. In the days that followed, The Soviets brought in forensic experts, photographers, and intelligence officers to examine every inch of the bunker. What they uncovered only deepened the mystery. The bodies of Hitler and Eva Braun had been hastily burned with gasoline in the courtyard above, a poor attempt by loyalists to prevent their remains from being displayed by the enemy. But the fire had been too weak, leaving partial remains that could still be examined. A Soviet pathologist laid the bones out on a metal table under a dim light. The skull fragments showed damage from a gunshot, and a set of dental bridges was recovered from the ashes. Those teeth would later become the most crucial evidence of all. Hitler's longtime dentist, interrogated under Soviet control, identified the remains beyond any doubt. And yet, Stalin refused to believe it. He ordered his men to seal the report and declare nothing. He did not want a confirmed death. He wanted a ghost, something that would linger in the minds of his rivals and his own people. The idea that Hitler might still be alive gave him power, and Stalin never wasted power when he could weaponize it. As news of Berlin's fall spread across Europe, the Western Allies waited for confirmation of Hitler's death. Churchill, Truman, and de Gaulle all demanded clarity from Moscow, but the Soviet responses were evasive. Stalin told them that Hitler could have escaped, that perhaps he was hiding under the protection of Western intelligence. It was a statement laced with manipulation. By keeping the truth hidden, Stalin not only controlled the narrative but also justified his military grip on Eastern Europe. Soviet troops remained in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and East Germany under the pretext that the fascist threat had not been fully eradicated. The world had entered a strange new phase where peace was only an illusion. The guns were silent, but distrust was spreading like wildfire. For the men in London and Washington, the mystery of Hitler's fate became an uncomfortable reminder that the war's end did not mean stability. A new enemy had emerged from the ashes, one cloaked in red banners and iron ideology. Inside the Soviet Union, Stalin's paranoia only deepened. He demanded that all materials from the bunker be transported to Moscow and locked away under the highest secrecy. The NKVD packed every document, bullet, and fragment of bone into metal crates stamped with black ink and sealed them tight. They were hidden in archives where only Stalin's closest men had access. He personally reviewed each report, circling details in red pencil, questioning inconsistencies, and crossing out statements he considered too Western. Witnesses were silenced, sometimes permanently. Several of Hitler's surviving aides, captured by the Soviets, were never seen again. Their testimonies had served their purpose, and now they were liabilities. Stalin's obsession with secrecy was not just about control, it was about rewriting history before it could even be written. By hoarding the truth, he could shape the narrative that the Soviet Union alone had crushed fascism and saved the world. The world outside would be left with rumors, speculation, and fear, and that suited him perfectly. While Stalin's men buried the truth, life in the ruins of Berlin carried on in eerie silence. The city was a wasteland of broken concrete and blackened trees. Civilians wandered through the wreckage in search of food, water, or lost family members. Above the bunker, Soviet soldiers planted their flag and took photographs, unaware that beneath their boots lay one of the most secret locations on Earth. As the months passed, the bunker began to fill with water from broken pipes and flooding streets. The air grew toxic, and eventually, the Soviets sealed the entrance completely. For the people of Berlin, the underground tomb became a forbidden place, a dark scar under the city that no one dared to disturb. It was as if the world had decided that burying the bunker would bury the memory of the man who caused it all. But history has a way of whispering through the cracks, and even as the rubble settled, the story of what really happened beneath Berlin refused to die. In the months that followed, Stalin's grip on Eastern Europe tightened like a steel vice. The Red Army's victory had given him not just land, but leverage. Governments in Poland, East Germany, and Hungary began to mirror Moscow's system of control, their leaders handpicked and trained to obey. Behind closed doors, Stalin spoke of liberation, but in truth, it was occupation under another name. His secret police infiltrated cities, factories, and universities, rooting out anyone suspected of disloyalty. To the people of Eastern Europe, liberation felt like a new kind of imprisonment. The Western allies, still exhausted from war, watched with concern, but were reluctant to confront the Soviet giant so soon after peace had been declared. Churchill, now out of office, would soon deliver his famous Iron Curtain speech, warning that half of Europe had been swallowed by shadow. Yet by then the gears of history were already turning, and the quiet tension between East and West had begun to harden into a new kind of conflict, one that would define the next half-century. As the Cold War took shape, the truth about Hitler's death remained buried behind Soviet walls. Intelligence agencies in the United States and Britain launched their own investigations, piecing together fragments from captured German officers and civilians who had fled Berlin. The Americans even conducted secret interviews with Hitler's surviving aides who had fallen into their custody, comparing every word to the Soviet reports. But without physical proof, doubt lingered. Rumors spread like wildfire that Hitler had escaped through secret tunnels or fled to South America with SS loyalists. Books, newspapers, and whispers in taverns all fed the growing myth. Stalin, ever the master manipulator, encouraged the uncertainty. Every time Western officials questioned the Soviets about Hitler's fate, they were met with vague answers and knowing smiles. The ambiguity served Stalin's purposes perfectly. As long as Hitler's death remained a question mark, the West remained uneasy, divided between triumph and suspicion. The dictator who had fallen in the bunker now lived on as a ghost, haunting the fragile peace that followed. Years later, as Stalin's paranoia reached its peak, he ordered his agents to remove the last physical traces of Hitler's remains. The bones, which had been buried and reburied in secret locations, were exhumed, burned again, and their ashes scattered into a river in East Germany. Only a few items were kept: fragments of a skull, a jawbone, and dentures sealed in a classified archive in Moscow. Stalin's final act of control was to ensure that no grave, no relic, no monument would ever exist to mark the dictator's end. The irony was heavy. In his attempt to erase Hitler from memory, Stalin became obsessed with him. He could never let go of the idea that his greatest enemy had cheated him of a public victory. This obsession shaped his decisions, his diplomacy, and even his treatment of his own people. Fear was the foundation of his rule, and as long as that fear could be tied to the ghost of Hitler, Stalin had reason to keep it alive. When Stalin died in 1953, much of his empire mourned out of fear, not love. His legacy, built on control and deception, outlived him by decades. The truth about Hitler's death and the Soviet cover-up would only surface long after the Cold War began to thaw. Historians later confirmed that Hitler had indeed died in the bunker, his body destroyed and hidden by Soviet secrecy. But by then, the damage was already done. The lies, the paranoia, and the manipulation had reshaped the world. The end of one dictator had given rise to another, and the flames of one war had ignited the cold embers of the next. From the ruins of Berlin to the heart of Moscow, the story was never really about how Hitler died. It was about how Stalin used that death to shape the modern world. The Cold War wasn't born on a battlefield, but in the silence that followed a single gunshot in a bunker beneath Berlin.